She loved him at 16, wrote it all down in a letter, slipped it under his door, and waited. He never answered. For 13 years, she believed he read every word, and chose silence. That silence became her armor, her rage, her reason to hate the only man she ever truly loved. But the letter never reached him. Someone else made sure of that. Tonight, the truth comes out, and it will destroy everything. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The first thing Aria Holloway did every morning was check that the walls were still up. Not literal walls. The kind you build over years, brick by brick, out of old humiliations and careful silences. She'd gotten good at it. 13 years of practice had made her nearly perfect at looking like a woman who needed nothing from anyone. Clean posture, measured eye contact, a handshake that ended before it became familiar. She was 31 years old and had designed her life the way she designed brand identities for her clients. Deliberate, controlled, nothing left to chance. She lived alone in a narrow apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, where the windows faced west and the light in the evenings turned everything amber and soft. She didn't own a pet. She didn't keep plants that needed too much attention. She had 3 close friends, a therapist she saw every other Thursday, and a consulting firm she'd built from nothing that now billed over $2 million a year. She was, by every visible measure, a woman who had figured it out. What she hadn't figured out, what she refused to look at directly, the way you refuse to look at a scar that still pulls when it rains, was Dante Moretti. She was thinking about him that Tuesday morning, which she hated, because she had a rule about Dante Moretti. She didn't think about him before 9 a.m. She didn't think about him on days that mattered. She especially didn't think about him when she was standing in her kitchen in an oversized sleep shirt, waiting for coffee to brew, because those were the moments when the armor was thinnest and the memories had the best chance of getting through. But her phone had buzzed at 6:52 with a message from her business partner, Cleo, and the message had included a name, and now here she was, thinking about him before the coffee was even ready. Dante Moretti's people reached out. They want a full rebrand consultation. Aria, this is 8 figures easy. Call me when you're human. She stared at the screen until the coffee machine beeped. Then she poured herself a cup, sat down at the kitchen table, and spent exactly 4 minutes being a person who was considering it professionally and not at all personally. She thought about the scope of the project. She thought about what a rebrand for an organization of that size would require. The research, the positioning strategy, the identity overhaul. She thought about the money, which was genuinely significant, and about what that kind of project would do for Holloway Creative's profile in the industry. She did not think about the way Dante Moretti's voice dropped half a register when he was angry. She did not think about the line of his jaw or the particular silence he used like a weapon. She did not think about the last time she'd seen him 8 months ago at her mother's birthday dinner, when he'd stood across the room in a dark suit and looked at her with that expression she'd never been able to fully decode, somewhere between confusion and something raw that he'd covered over immediately, like a man smoothing a crease from an expensive jacket. She called Cleo at 7:15. "Tell them we'll consider it," she said. "You sound like you're already deciding against it." "I said we'll consider it." "Aria." Cleo's voice dropped into the tone she used when she was about to say something true and inconvenient. "It's Dante Moretti. Whatever happened between you two, nothing happened between us. Whatever didn't happen then, you need to put it in a box for a few months and make us both very rich." Aria looked out the window. The light was still gray, the city not yet fully awake. "Send me the brief," she said. "I'll read it today." She hung up before Cleo could say anything else. The brief arrived by encrypted courier at 10 a.m., which was the first sign that this was not going to be an ordinary client engagement. Not email, not a PDF attachment. An actual courier, dressed in a dark jacket, who handed her a sealed envelope and waited while she signed for it with her full legal name. The envelope contained a 12-page document printed on heavy stock paper, clipped rather than stapled, outlining the Moretti Group's desire to rebrand 3 of its 7 public-facing corporate entities under a unified luxury umbrella. The language was precise and careful, the kind of corporate speak that had been reviewed by lawyers. But the scope was extraordinary. Vineyards, hospitality properties, a private equity arm. And whoever had written the brief understood brand architecture well enough to know exactly what they were asking for. At the bottom of the final page, handwritten in black ink, were 3 words. Hope you'll help. She recognized the handwriting. She had studied it once, a long time ago, the way you study something you're trying to memorize. She set the brief face down on her desk and stood at her office window for a long moment, watching the traffic on Sunset move in both directions. Then she turned around, picked it back up, and kept reading. Dun. They met 3 days later at the Moretti Group's Los Angeles headquarters, a glass and concrete building in Century City that looked expensive in the way that was meant to suggest legitimacy rather than flaunt wealth. Arya arrived 7 minutes early, which was her standard. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, dark trousers, heels that were professional rather than performative. She had her leather portfolio under one arm and her hair pulled back, and she had spent approximately 40 minutes that morning telling herself that this was a business meeting and nothing else. The lobby was staffed by 2 people at a curved reception desk, both young, both perfectly dressed, both with the kind of practiced neutrality that costs money to cultivate. One of them escorted her to a conference room on the 22nd floor without asking her name, which meant they already knew it, which meant Dante had briefed his staff on her arrival, which she noted and filed away without letting it show on her face. The conference room was long and cool, with a wall of windows that faced south toward the ocean. A glass pitcher of water sat at the center of the table. She poured herself a glass, sat down, and opened her portfolio. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, he wasn't speaking, but the change in pressure that occurred when Dante Moretti entered a room, the way the air reorganized itself around him. It was something she had noticed at 16 and had never been able to entirely dismiss, and it irritated her profoundly that 13 years of deliberate hardening hadn't corrected it. He came in with 2 people, a man she didn't recognize in a gray suit, and a woman with a tablet who seemed to function as an extension of Dante's operational brain. Dante himself was in a dark navy suit, no tie, collar open 1 button. He was 41 years old and carried it the way some men do. Not by fighting it, but by having grown fully into himself, the softness of youth replaced by something more precise and considerably more dangerous. He looked at her the moment he walked in. She looked back. Neither of them smiled. "Arya," he said. "Mr. Moretti," she said. Something flickered across his face. Brief, controlled, gone. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, sat, and opened the folder in front of him with the kind of unhurried precision that told you he was a man accustomed to being the most patient person in any room. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I go where the work is." "Right." He held her gaze for a moment. "Let's talk about the work." They talked about the work for 2 hours. And the thing was, the genuinely inconvenient thing that Arya had not fully prepared herself for was that he was good. Not performatively good. Not good in the way of someone who had surrounded himself with competent people and learned to nod at the right moments. Dante Moretti had a clear, unsentimental understanding of what his public-facing companies needed and what they were currently failing at. He pushed back on 2 of her initial positioning recommendations with specific, well-reasoned counterpoints. He asked questions that weren't softballs. She found herself leaning forward at one point, mid-sentence, and caught herself, and leaned back and kept talking. The man in the gray suit was named Patterson. Legal. The woman with the tablet was called Vera. Operations. They were both sharp. But the meeting wasn't really a meeting between Arya and Patterson and Vera. It was a meeting between Arya and Dante, with Patterson and Vera as witnesses. When it was over, Patterson and Vera gathered their things and left. Dante remained seated. Arya began sliding papers back into her portfolio. "You're good at this," he said. "I know." A pause. "That wasn't a compliment designed to soften you up." "I know that too." She closed the portfolio and looked up. "Is there something else you needed to cover, or why do you hate me?" The question landed flat and direct, no preamble, and for a half-second the room felt smaller. Arya kept her face neutral. She had practiced this. She had the walls. "I don't hate you," she said. "I barely think about you." He didn't respond immediately. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had always seen more than she wanted them to, and she felt the old, particular discomfort of being read by someone you'd rather remain opaque to. "You've treated me like an enemy since you were about 22, he said. "Before that, you were—" He stopped. "I was what?" He seemed to choose his next words carefully. Different. People change, she said. Are we done here? Not quite. He reached into his jacket pocket and slid a business card across the table. Not a corporate card, a personal one, matte black, just his name and a number. I'd like to work with Holloway Creative. I'd like to work with you specifically, but I want to understand the terms. She looked at the card. The terms are in the proposal I'll send over by Friday. I mean the personal terms. She picked up the card and slid it into her portfolio. There are no personal terms, Dante. If we work together, it's professional. If you can't handle professional, we don't work together. It's very simple. She stood, gathered her things, and walked to the door. Arya. She stopped, didn't turn around. Whatever I did, he said, or didn't do, I'd like to know, at some point. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her back to him, her jaw tight, and the walls very carefully, very deliberately, holding. You didn't do anything, she said, and walked out. Well, she made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking. Not badly, just a fine tremor in the fingers of her right hand that she pressed flat against her thigh until the elevator arrived and the doors closed and she was alone, rising, and could allow herself exactly 30 seconds of being something other than composed. She used 20 of them. Then she straightened her spine, looked at her own reflection in the elevator's brushed steel surface, and told herself what she always told herself. It was a long time ago. It doesn't matter, you're fine. It was a script she'd been running for 13 years. Most of the time it worked. She'd been 16 when she wrote the letter. God, even remembering it now felt like pressing on a bruise that had never fully healed. That specific, helpless humiliation of having been young and stupid and wide open in a way she would never allow herself to be again. She had grown up in a house that was loud in all the right and wrong ways. Her father, Carmine Holloway, was a man of considerable appetites and minimal emotional vocabulary, a second-generation Italian-American who had done well in commercial real estate and spent his considerable energy either working or throwing dinner parties that lasted until 2 in the morning. Her mother, Sandra, was a woman of exceptional social grace who had learned early to be the ballast in a family that otherwise listed heavily toward chaos. And then there was her brother, Marco. Marco Holloway was 5 years older than Arya, and he was the kind of older brother who occupied every room he entered without meaning to. Big-voiced, magnetic, reckless, in the particular way of young men who have never encountered a consequence they couldn't charm their way out of. He was also deeply, genuinely protective of Arya in a way that she had spent years being grateful for, and years resenting in almost equal measure. Dante Moretti had come into their world through Marco. They'd met at 21 and 19 respectively, during a period when Marco was running adjacent to the organized networks that their father was cautiously connected to through real estate. Dante had been different from the others Marco brought home. Quieter, more deliberate, with a stillness about him that made you want to watch him when he wasn't watching you. Arya had been watching him since she was 14, from doorways and stairwells and the edges of dinner tables. She was invisible to most of the people in her brother's world, which suited her fine, because being invisible meant she could look. She had been a shy kid, painfully, specifically shy, the kind where speaking in class felt like voluntary exposure and crowded rooms produced a low-level panic she'd never fully learned to name. She'd managed it with sketchbooks. She drew everything, all the time, little detailed scenes of the world around her that she never showed to anyone, because showing them would mean someone looking at what was hers. She'd drawn Dante more than once. She'd hated herself for it. By the time she was 16, what she felt for him had moved well past the easy dismissals of a crush. She thought about him with a consistency and specificity that frightened her. She noticed when he was tired. She noticed when he was performing ease rather than feeling it. She noticed the way he was different around Marco. More relaxed, the careful stillness dropping slightly, and the way he was different when he thought no one was watching, which was when he seemed most real. She had kept all of this locked up like something radioactive, because she was 16 and he was 21, and the gap felt geological, and also because he was Marco's closest friend, and also because she was Arya Holloway, who didn't talk to boys she liked, who didn't talk to anyone she liked, who expressed everything she felt in small drawings in a sketchbook she kept hidden under her mattress. The letter was an act of madness. She understood that even then. She'd written it over 3 nights at the desk in her bedroom, drafting and throwing away and drafting again until what remained was something she could actually stand behind. Honest without being pathetic, she hoped, careful without being cold. She told him that she knew it was probably strange. She told him she knew the timing, and the situation made it complicated. She told him she wasn't expecting anything, wasn't asking him for anything. She just couldn't carry it anymore without saying it once, out loud, to the person it was about. She didn't sign her name with hope. She signed it because it was true. She'd slipped it under the door of his suite at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, when the house was quiet and Marco was out and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Then she went back to her room, got into bed, and lay flat on her back in the dark for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling. And then she waited. A week passed, then 2. She watched him across dinner tables and through doorways the way she always had, looking for something in his face, some small sign of acknowledgement, discomfort, pity, anything. There was nothing. He was the same, present and careful and slightly distant and utterly unreachable. By the 3rd week, she understood. He had read it. He had simply chosen not to respond, which was its own kind of response, the loudest kind, the cruelest kind. The kind that said, "This doesn't warrant my time." She had lain in bed that night with her teeth clenched and her face turned into the pillow and felt something calcify in her chest. She hadn't cried. She'd been too angry for crying, and the anger had felt better anyway. Cleaner, more sustainable. She'd taken the sketchbook from under her mattress and thrown it in the back of her closet without opening it. She never drew him again. The Friday after the Century City meeting, she sent over the proposal. It was good. She knew it was good, had spent the better part of 2 days making sure it was exactly as good as it needed to be, because if she was going to do this, she was going to do it the right way. And the right way meant no one could ever say she let personal history compromise her professional judgment. The scope was laid out in clean, unambiguous terms. The timeline was realistic. The budget was significant but defensible. Dante's office responded within 4 hours. Accepted, with 2 minor requested changes, both reasonable. They started the following Monday. The first 3 weeks were professional, correctly, carefully professional. They met twice a week in the conference room on the 22nd floor. Aria came with her team, Cleo, and a strategist named Ben, and sometimes a junior associate named Priya, who was terrifyingly competent for 24. Dante came with Vera and whoever else the meeting required. They talked about brand positioning and visual identity systems and consumer perception mapping, and Aria was very good at her job, and Dante was engaged and prepared, and they covered significant ground. The room stayed formal. The silences were productive rather than charged. Aria told herself frequently and with some conviction that this was fine. This was good, even. She was a professional, and so was he, and whatever had been between them, or rather, whatever she had projected onto him from a distance 13 years ago, had no bearing on the present. Then he started talking more. Not about the project. About the project, he was efficient, direct, no excess. But between agenda items, or while they were waiting for someone to pull up a file, or in the walk between the elevator and the conference room, he began filling the space with conversation. He asked her where she'd gone for her MBA. He asked about a ring she wore on her right hand, a wide silver band with a hammered texture. And when she said she'd bought it at a street market in Porto, he asked if she traveled a lot for work or for herself. And when she said mostly for herself, he looked at her like he was revising something in his head. She kept her answer short, informative but not warm. He kept asking anyway. On the 22nd day of the engagement, they were alone in the conference room for approximately 4 minutes while their respective colleagues were getting coffee. Dante was looking at the brand architecture she'd sketched on the whiteboard, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. Aria was at the table, reviewing notes. "You remember the summer you were about 15, he said, not turning around, when Marco convinced your dad to let him host that 4th of July party? She looked up. "I remember. You hid in the library the entire time." "I wasn't hiding." He did turn around then. "You were in there for 6 hours." "I was reading." Something close to a smile crossed his face, brief, involuntary, the kind that happens before you can edit it. What were you reading? She looked back at her notes. I don't remember. She remembered perfectly. She'd been reading a novel about a woman who ran away to the coast of Maine. She'd also been watching, through the slightly open library door, a gathering she didn't know how to participate in. And she'd been angry at herself for not knowing, and she'd spent about 45 minutes of those 6 hours drawing a very small, very detailed picture of the oak tree in the backyard before she remembered that drawing calmed her down. You never liked crowds, Dante said. Still don't. But you present to rooms full of people for your job. That's different. How? She looked up again. He was watching her with a kind of careful attention that she recognized from a long time ago. The look that had undone her at 16, the look that had felt like being truly seen by someone who didn't see most people. It's different because I control the room, she said. I know exactly what I'm doing and why I'm there. That's not the same as a party. He considered this seriously, which was another thing about him that hadn't changed. He actually thought about what you said. He didn't just wait for you to finish talking so he could say the next thing. That makes sense, he said. Their respective teams came back, the moment dissolved. Arya looked at her notes and told herself again that she was fine. The gala was Cleo's idea, and Arya immediately recognized it as a mistake. The Moretti Group was a presenting sponsor of a charity gala at a hotel in Beverly Hills, and Cleo had obtained 2 invitations on the basis that it would be excellent for the firm's visibility and would allow them to see how the Moretti brand was currently presenting in a high-profile social context. Research, essentially. Arya had agreed to this reasoning before she'd fully thought through what it meant to attend a formal event at which Dante Moretti would be hosting. The gala was black tie. The hotel was the kind that had been beautiful for 60 years and intended to stay that way. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom was full of people who had money and were comfortable having it, and there was a full orchestra, and the champagne was very good. And Arya was standing near a window with Cleo talking about precisely nothing when she felt the particular shift in atmospheric pressure that she had been feeling for nearly 3 weeks and still couldn't entirely brace herself against. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Miss Holloway, Dante was at her shoulder. You look... He paused. You came. I'm here for research purposes, she said, because it was true and also because it was the safest thing to say. Cleo extended her hand and introduced herself with the warm, practiced ease that Arya had always slightly envied, and the two of them exchanged pleasantries, and Arya drank her champagne and kept her eyes on the room and tried not to be aware of how close Dante was standing. He moved away after a few minutes. She watched him work the room, which was its own education in how a certain kind of man performed in public, effortless and controlled and entirely present wherever he was, whatever conversation he was in. He shook hands. He listened. He laughed at the right moments without overselling it. He also glanced back at her twice. She looked away both times. An hour later, she excused herself to use the restroom and was navigating through the outer lobby when she felt it. A sudden, sickening tug at the back of her dress. She reached back instinctively and felt the consequences of a thin spaghetti strap that had been subtly straining all evening. The back of her gown had pulled at the seam and was now dangerously, embarrassingly close to a wardrobe failure in the lobby of a hotel full of people she either knew professionally or was about to. She went very still. Don't move, said a voice behind her, low and even. Dante. She felt him step close, not touching, but close. And then the particular steadying pressure of 2 fingers at the top of the seam, holding the fabric together with a precision that suggested he had assessed the situation faster than she had. Is there somewhere you can... Ladies' room, she said, barely above a whisper. 15 feet at your left. I've got it. They walked. Side by side, almost touching, Dante's hand flat against the back of her gown with the seamless composure of a man who had managed far worse emergencies, and Arya with her spine straight and her face forward and her heart hammering for a reason that had nothing to do with embarrassment. At the door to the restroom, he let go. I'll have someone bring a kit, he said quietly. Give me 3 minutes. She turned to look at him. This close, in the lower light of the lobby, she could see the small scar at the edge of his jaw she'd noticed a long time ago, and never asked about. And the way his eyes were dark and entirely focused on her. Not on the situation, on her. Thank you, she said. Something moved through his expression. Arya... "Thank you," she said again, and pushed through the door. She stood in front of the restroom mirror for a full minute with her hands gripping the edge of the sink, looking at her own face, telling herself very firmly that he had simply been helpful, and that was all, and it didn't mean anything. A knock at the door. A young woman's voice. "Ms. Holloway, Mr. Moretti asked me to bring this." She opened the door and accepted the small emergency sewing kit. Behind the young woman, across the lobby, Dante was already back among the guests, laughing at something someone was saying. He didn't look back. She fixed the seam herself, returned to the ballroom, and stayed for exactly 45 more minutes. On the drive home, Cleo talked about the evening. Arya looked out the passenger window and said very little. The walls were still up, but they were, for the first time in a very long time, leaning. 3 days after the gala, an email arrived from Vera. The Moretti Group was requesting an intensive work session at one of their vineyard properties in Sonoma. 3 days, full creative team, to develop the brand's regional identity elements in context. The vineyard in question was the flagship property, the one at the center of the rebrand. It made operational sense to be there. Arya forwarded the email to Cleo with no comment. Cleo called within 90 seconds. "We're going," Cleo said. "We're evaluating the request." Arya, 3 days in Sonoma. All expenses paid. It's a vineyard. "I'm aware." "We're going," Cleo said again, and hung up. Arya sat with the email for a while longer, rereading the logistical details, looking for a professional reason to decline. She couldn't find one. She typed her acceptance, sent it, and went back to work. She did not think about 3 days in a place where Dante Moretti would be present and there would be nowhere to redirect herself to. She thought about it constantly. So, they drove up on a Wednesday morning, Arya and Cleo in one car, Ben and Priya following in another, and the Sonoma Valley in early October was the kind of beautiful that felt almost accusatory. Golden light through the vines, the hills that specific rust and green, the air tasting like something you couldn't quite name but would recognize the rest of your life. The Moretti vineyard was set back from the road behind a long gravel drive lined with olive trees. The main house was old California ranch, low and wide, with deep covered porches and the kind of heavy wood doors that had been there for decades. Behind it, the vines stretched in long, even rows toward the hills. There were outbuildings, a wine warehouse, a processing facility, staff cottages, and the whole property had the feeling of a place that had been cared for by serious people. Dante was at the main house when they arrived, standing on the porch with a man Arya didn't know, talking about something with the quiet intensity that she had come to associate with the specific frequency of his concentration. He stopped mid-sentence when the car came up the drive. He came down the steps. "You made it," he said. "We're early," Arya said. "I know." Again, that almost smile. "I noticed." Eat. The first day was productive in a way that felt like setting something in motion that couldn't be easily stopped. Being at the vineyard did what Vera had said it would. It gave the brand identity work a physical context, a sensory reference. They walked the property in the morning, Dante explaining the winemaking process with a knowledge that was clearly firsthand and not briefed. And Arya took notes and asked questions and tried to think of it as creative research rather than as spending 2 hours walking through one of the most beautiful places she had ever been with a man she was working very hard to stay neutral about. In the afternoon, they worked in the main house's dining room, spreading materials across the long table, and the conversation moved between professional and personal in the way that happens when you're in a space that isn't an office, slower, less defended. Cleo asked Dante how long his family had owned the vineyard, and he said almost 20 years, that he'd bought it when he was barely 23 and everyone had told him he was out of his mind, and Cleo said that was incredible, and Dante said it was stubborn, and for a moment his eyes cut to Arya in a way that felt like a private conversation in the middle of a group one. That night, dinner was on the porch. The vineyard's own wine, food brought in from a restaurant in town, the kind of informal ease that happens when you're away from the city and the roles loosen slightly. Priya had clearly done research and was asking Dante intelligent questions about the hospitality arm of the business. Ben was talking to Vera about wine regions. Cleo was laughing at something one of Dante's other staff members had said. Arya was sitting at the end of the table, slightly outside the warm circle of conversation, which was where she tended to put herself, which was where she was comfortable. Dante came and sat beside her. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Watching from the edge." She looked at him. "I'm participating." "You're monitoring," he said. "It's different." She thought about saying something dismissive. Instead, she said, "It's how I've always worked. I notice things better when I'm not in the middle of them." He considered this. "What are you noticing right now?" "That Priya is going to be exceptional," she said, watching her junior associate across the table. "In about 3 years, she's going to run someone's creative department, and whoever gets her will be very lucky." Dante followed her gaze. "And Cleo?" "Cleo is the reason the firm works," Arya said. "She makes people feel safe. I'm better at making them feel certain." He looked back at her. "You don't think those are the same thing?" "They're completely different things." He turned his wine glass slowly in his hand. "What do you notice about me?" She looked at him for a long moment, aware of the porch and the evening and the way the light was doing something specific to everything around them, the kind of soft that didn't leave much to hide behind. "You're better in person than you are on paper," she said. "On paper, you're just powerful. In person, you're actually interesting." He stared at her. "Is that a compliment?" he said. "It's an observation." The corner of his mouth pulled. "I'll take it." They sat there for another few minutes in a silence that, for the first time in 3 weeks of meetings and careful professionalism, wasn't tactical. Arya picked up her wine and looked at the vines and told herself she wasn't in trouble. She was lying. The storm came on the second night without much warning. It had been building all day. The sky turning heavy by afternoon, the air carrying that metallic edge that meant something serious was coming. But the forecast had said light rain, and the forecast was wrong. By 9 o'clock, the wind had picked up hard, and by 9:30 it was coming in from the coast with the kind of force that knocked things over and made driving impossible, and the power to the main house went out at 9:52. Dante had sent everyone inside before the worst of it. Staff were handling the generators. The cottages were solid. By 10 o'clock, the situation was manageable, if loud. Arya had gone to check on something in the wine warehouse, a reference sample they'd been using for the brand color work, and had made the miscalculation of thinking she had more time than she did. The storm came in fast and hard, and by the time she reached the warehouse door and pulled it shut behind her, the rain was horizontal, and the olive trees along the drive were bent nearly in half. The warehouse was old stone, thick-walled, and the weather couldn't get through it. Emergency lighting had kicked on along the low edges of the walls, dim but enough. She stood in the doorway catching her breath, her blazer soaked through, water dripping from her hair. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind the door a moment before it opened again, and then Dante was inside, just as wet, pulling the heavy door shut against the wind with both hands. He turned around, saw her, and stopped. "I thought you'd gone in," he said. "I came for the samples." He looked at her for a moment, water running down his face. "The road to the main house is a river right now." "Okay. We're going to be here for a while." She looked around this warehouse. It was long and stone, barrels stacked in rows, the emergency light casting everything in amber tones. There were 2 old wooden chairs near the central work table, the kind of place where someone sat to do paperwork surrounded by wine. She walked over and sat in one of them. Dante stood for a moment longer, looking at the door and the sounds coming through it. Then he pulled off his wet jacket, hung it over a barrel, and sat in the other chair. The storm pressed against the walls. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Dante said, "Why do you hate me?" Not gently, not leading up to it, just flat, direct. The question he'd asked in the conference room 3 weeks ago, asked again now, in a stone room with nowhere to go, and the wind making it impossible to pretend the world outside existed. Arya sat with her hands in her lap, and the soaked ends of her hair dripping on her collar, and felt the walls, the ones she had built so carefully, over so many years, vibrate under the pressure of the storm and this room and this man sitting 4 feet away asking her the things she had spent 13 years making sure nobody asked her. "I don't hate you," she said. "Arya, I told you, I know what you told me." His voice was even but not patient anymore. Something underneath it that she hadn't heard before, something that sounded like it had been held down for a long time. "I know what you said in the conference room. I'm asking you here. I'm asking you now. Because something happened, and you never told me, and I have been trying to figure out what I did wrong for the better part of a decade. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, stripped of the careful composure, the practiced control. Something that looked almost like it hurt. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said very quietly. "Then why?" "You didn't do anything at all." The words came out before she could stop them, before the walls could catch them. That was the problem. You didn't do anything at all. The storm pushed against the stone. The amber light flickered once and held. Dante stared at her. "Arya," he said. "What are you talking about?" She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the floor between them and said, for the first time in 13 years, the thing she had sworn she would never say out loud again. "I wrote you a letter. When I was 16, I left it under the door of your suite, and you never—" Her voice caught. She pushed through it. "You never said anything. You acted like it never happened. And I understood what that meant. I understood very clearly what that meant. So I—" She stopped, breathed. "So I stopped being the girl who wrote you letters." The silence that followed was the longest of her adult life. When she finally looked up, Dante's face had done something she had no framework for. The color had changed slightly. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man absorbing something that was hitting him wrong, hitting him hard. "What letter?" he said. Her heart went very still. "What do you mean, what?" "Arya." His voice was careful now, frighteningly careful. "I never received a letter." She stared at him. "I never received anything," he said. "Not a letter, not a note, nothing. The walls didn't come down. They didn't have to. They simply became irrelevant, because the thing she had built them to protect against, the crushing certainty of having been read and ignored, was suddenly, impossibly uncertain. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't—" She stopped. "That's not—" She stopped again. Dante leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what you did with the letter." "I slipped it under the door," she said. Her voice was barely there. "The door of your suite. At 2 a.m, She stopped. "You were staying in the East Wing, the room at the end of the hall." Something shifted in his face. "Arya," he said slowly. "My room was never in the East Wing." She felt the floor tilt. "Marco moved me the first week I stayed," Dante said. "He said something about the East Wing room having a plumbing issue. I was in the room above the library for the whole year." He was watching her with the specific intensity of a man who was recalculating something very fast. Whatever room was at the end of the East Wing hall, Arya's mouth went dry. She knew whose room was at the end of the East Wing hall. She knew. The name formed in her head and she couldn't say it out loud. Not yet, not here, not until she was sure, because if she was right about what this meant, then 13 years of her life had been built on the wrong foundation, and she needed to be very, very sure before she let herself understand that. Dante was still watching her, still calculating, still with that look on his face that said he was getting to the same place she was. The storm raged outside the old stone walls. "Who was in the East Wing room?" he asked, very quietly. Arya already knew the answer, and from the look on his face, so did he. Matsik. The name sat between them like a third person in the room. Neither of them said it. Arya could hear the storm working at the edges of the warehouse, wind finding the gaps in the old stone, rain hammering the roof in sheets, and she was aware, distantly, that she was still wet, that her blazer was cold against her shoulders, that there was water on the floor near the door. She was aware of all of this, the way you're aware of background noise when something in the foreground is taking up every available frequency. "Say it," Dante said. "Marco." The word came out flat, factual, like she was reading it off a document rather than saying her brother's name. Dante sat back in his chair. Not dramatically. He barely moved, just a slight shift of weight, a settling. But something in his face closed down, the way a door closes when someone on the other side of it has made a decision. "You're sure," he said. His room was at the end of the East Wing. It was his room for 3 years. She heard her own voice from a distance, even, controlled, the professional voice, the voice she used when she needed to not feel what she was feeling. "He moved to the main house after he turned 23, and I was in the room above the library." "You're saying you were never in the East Wing?" I'm saying I was never in the East Wing. She stood up, not because she had anywhere to go. The storm was still outside and the door was still shut and there was nowhere, but because sitting felt wrong, felt passive, felt like something you did when you were processing, and she was not ready to process. She walked to the nearest row of barrels and stood with her back to him and her hands braced on the cold wood and her jaw clamped shut around whatever was trying to come out. 13 years. She had carried it for 13 years. The weight of it, the specific shape of it, the humiliation of having been read and dismissed, the bitter certainty of having been too young and too much and not enough simultaneously. She had built a whole self around the wound. She had made choices, professional choices, personal choices, choices about who she let close and how close she let them, that led in a direct line back to that letter and what she believed it had cost her. And it was possible. It was more than possible. It was looking increasingly like the only explanation, that the letter had never reached the man she wrote it for, that someone else had intercepted it, that someone else had made the decision for both of them. Arya. Don't. She didn't turn around. Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. She counted it. She breathed through it the way her therapist had taught her, slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that was supposed to create space between stimulus and response. It worked, partially. The thing trying to get out stayed down. She turned around. Dante was watching her. He'd leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, and he looked. She searched for the right word and found it. Implicated. He looked like a man sitting with the weight of something that wasn't his fault, but had his name on it anyway. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask it. And I need you to answer it honestly, not carefully, not the version of honest that protects someone. Actually, honestly. Something moved through his expression. He nodded once. Back then, she said, if you had received it, if you'd read it. She stopped, assembled the next part. Would it have mattered? The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. She watched him not look away from her, watched him sit with the question rather than rushing the answer. And she remembered, against her will, with the particular vividness of something you've tried hard to forget, that this was one of the things about him that had undone her at 16. He took things seriously. He took her seriously. Even when she was a teenager in the doorway of her father's library, watching his friend's world from a safe distance, she had felt, somehow, that he had noticed she was there. Yes, he said, it would have mattered. She had not expected the directness. She had expected something more careful, a qualification, a hedge, the reasonable adult caveat about age and situation and the mafia world he was building himself inside. She had expected something she could deflect. What does that mean? She said. It means I noticed you. His voice was level, but the words cost something. She could hear it, the slight roughness underneath. You were 16 and I was 21 and I told myself it was the wrong thing to look at. But I looked anyway. And if you'd... He stopped, jaw tight. If I'd known you felt it too. She held very still. You would have done what? She said. You were 21. I was a teenager. You were Marco's best friend. You were already... She gestured vaguely, meaning the organization, the world he was building that wasn't clean and wasn't safe, already becoming what you became. I know. So what would you have done, Dante? Exactly. I don't know. He said it simply, without apology. I like to think I would have been honest with you, that I would have told you that the timing was wrong and the situation was wrong, but that what I felt... He stopped again, looked at the floor for a moment, looked back up. I don't know what I would have done, but I would have done something. I would have at least acknowledged that you existed. The last 4 words landed somewhere she hadn't armored properly. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall. Instead, you spent 13 years thinking I didn't bother to respond, he said. Yes. And you spent 13 years... Don't. She looked at him. Don't map out what I spent 13 years doing. I was there for all of it. He held up one hand, conceding. Okay. The storm banged against the door. Something outside, a branch maybe, something caught in the wind, struck the roof, and they both looked up instinctively and then back at each other in the same motion, which under other circumstances might have been funny. We don't know for certain, she said, that it was Marco. No. There could be another explanation. Dante looked at her steadily. What other explanation? She didn't have one. She'd been trying to construct one for the last 10 minutes, and she didn't have one, because the geography was the geography, and the rooms were where the rooms were, and the letter had gone under the wrong door, and the only person who occupied that room was her brother. I need to talk to him, she said. Yes. Not tonight. No, Dante agreed. Not tonight. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, just against the cold, the wet blazer finally making itself known, and looked at the space between them, the two old chairs and the stone floor and the amber light and the storm outside, and thought about how strange it was that she had spent 3 weeks being very carefully professional in conference rooms and had ended up here anyway. I'm going to ask you something else, she said. All right. What you said. About noticing me. She looked at him directly. Was that real, or was that... She searched for the word. Was that you being kind because of what I just told you? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Arya, I have never in my life said something to be kind when I could have said nothing instead. She believed him. That was the thing. She had been trying not to believe him for 3 weeks, and she believed him anyway. The way you believe something not because you want to, but because it's consistent with everything you've observed. She sat back down in the chair. Neither of them spoke for a while. The storm pressed on. The wine barrels stood in their silent rows. Dante poured 2 small measures from a bottle that had been sitting on the work table, already open, someone's working sample, and held one out to her. She took it without comment. They sat with the wine and the storm and 13 years of recalibration, and Arya told herself that she still didn't know anything for certain, and that she needed to talk to Marco before she let herself land anywhere, and that the conversation that had just happened in this warehouse could not and would not be allowed to become anything more than what it was. Then Dante said, very quietly, I'm sorry. She looked at him. For whatever part I played, he said, even if I didn't know. You were 16 and alone with something that should have gotten an answer, and you didn't get one. And I'm sorry. She looked at the wine in her glass, dark, almost black in the amber light. You didn't know, she said. Doesn't change what you carried. She didn't say anything to that. She couldn't. The words sat in her chest in the specific way of true things that you're not ready to let all the way in. Outside, very gradually, the storm began to ease. They made it back to the main house at midnight, walking through rain that had dropped to a steady drizzle, using a flashlight from the warehouse emergency kit. They didn't talk on the walk. The gravel was washed out in places, and they picked their way carefully, and once Dante caught her arm when she slipped on a wet stone, and the contact lasted approximately 2 seconds before she steadied herself and he let go. The main house had 1 generator running, enough for the kitchen and 2 of the bedrooms. Cleo was in the kitchen when they came in, awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone and what appeared to be a very large glass of red wine. She looked at them both, soaked and quiet, and her expression did the thing that Cleo's expressions did, which was communicate significant information without saying any of it. Storm pass, she said. Mostly, Dante said. Generator holding up okay? Vera's got it under control. Cleo looked at Arya. You all right? Fine, Arya said. I'm going to change. She went to her cottage without looking back. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the narrow cottage bed with her hands folded on her chest and stared at the ceiling and thought about Marco. Marco, who had been 21 when she wrote the letter, who had already been running interference in her life for as long as she could remember, protective in the way of someone who saw protection and control as the same thing, who had been the one to introduce Dante to the family in the first place, who had made Dante part of their world and simultaneously made sure Arya stayed in her corner of it. Sweet, quiet, shy Arya, who didn't know anything about the life Marco was building for himself, who needed to be kept separate. She thought about the version of events in which Marco had found the letter, slipped under the wrong door, retrieved before anyone else saw it, read by her brother's 21-year-old eyes, and had made a decision. She thought about what that decision said about what he thought of her. She thought about 16-year-old Arya waiting for an answer that was never going to come, and the particular way she had slowly, quietly closed every door inside herself that had ever been open. She thought about the sketchbook in the back of the closet, She thought about every relationship she'd kept at arm's length since, every time she'd pulled back at exactly the moment something real was being offered, every wall she'd built and called a boundary and called healthy and called self-preservation. She thought about 13 years. By 4 a.m., she had stopped trying to sleep. She got up, made tea with the electric kettle in the cottage's small kitchen, and sat at the little table by the window and watched the vineyard slowly emerge from the dark as the sky turned from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. She was going to have to talk to Marco. Not to hurt him, not to punish him, but because she had been carrying something that wasn't hers to carry, and she needed to understand why he had put it on her. But the third day of the work session happened anyway, because life does that, because schedules don't pause for late-night revelations in stone warehouses. And Arya sat in the main house's dining room with her team and did her job, which she was still perfectly capable of doing, which was one of the things she had always been able to count on. Whatever was happening inside her, the professional architecture held. Dante sat across the table for 6 hours and did the same thing. They were both functioning, both present, both covering significant ground. They spoke to each other when the work required it and otherwise stayed in their respective lanes. But she was aware of him differently now. The way you're aware of something once you stop pretending you can't see it. At the end of the day, when the teams were packing up and Vera was coordinating the logistics of the return trip, Dante found a moment when they were the only two people in the room. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I know." She went back to closing her portfolio. "I'm going to talk to Marco when we get back." "Do you want me there?" "No." She said it without hesitation. "This is between me and him first." He accepted that with the nod. He didn't push. "Arya." His voice was different, careful, but not in the edited way, in the deliberate way. "Whatever happens after you talk to him, after you have the information, don't," she said. Not harshly. He stopped. "I know what you're about to say," she said, "and I need you to not say it yet. I need to get through the next conversation first." He looked at her for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than a professional moment had any business lasting. Then he said, "Okay." She nodded, picked up her portfolio, walked to the door. "Arya." She stopped. "The letter," he said. "What did it say?" She didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway with her back to him and the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that turned everything amber, and thought about what she'd written at 16. Careful, terrifying, honest in a way she had never been since. "Everything," she said, and walked out. Thoughts. She called Marco on the drive back to Los Angeles, not to have the conversation, not yet, but to set it up. "Can I come over Friday?" she said. Of course. His voice was easy, warm, the big brother voice she had known her entire life. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I just need to see you." "Okay, Arya." A pause. "You sure nothing's wrong?" She looked out the car window at the valley falling away behind them. "I'm sure," she said. "Friday." She hung up. Cleo drove. The road unwound ahead of them. "You going to tell me what happened in that warehouse?" Cleo said, after about 15 minutes of radio silence. "No," Arya said. "Okay." Cleo reached over and turned the radio on, something low and unhurried. "You want me to drop it completely? Or just for today?" Arya looked at the road. "Just for today." "Done," Cleo said, and let her alone. Friday came. Marco's house was in Silver Lake, 4 blocks from the apartment he'd grown up in when their parents had downsized after the kids left home. He'd bought it in his early 30s, a Spanish bungalow with a lemon tree in the backyard and a front porch wide enough to fit a table. And it had the particular quality of a house that had been lived in by someone who knew what he wanted and wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was in the kitchen when she arrived, which was where he usually was, because Marco was one of those people who cooked as a love language and couldn't conduct a difficult conversation without something happening on the stove at the same time. He'd made coffee. He'd also made a frittata that was currently in the oven, which meant he'd been expecting this to be a long one. She sat down at the kitchen table. He poured her coffee without asking. He was 42 now, her brother, and he looked like their father in the ways she always noticed first: the build, the way he occupied space, the dark hair that had started going silver at the temples, and like himself in the ways that mattered, which were harder to name. He sat down across from her with his own coffee and looked at her with the steady, patient attention of a man who had been waiting for something he couldn't quite identify. "Tell me about Dante's room," she said. The silence was instantaneous and specific, the kind that happens not because someone is searching for an answer, but because they weren't expecting the question to arrive from that direction. Marco's hand tightened slightly around his mug. "What?" he said. "When he stayed with us." She kept her voice flat, even. "You moved him from the East Wing. When was that?" He looked at her steadily. He was good at this. Marco was always good at the composed face, the unhurried response. He'd learned it early in the same world Dante had, but she knew his face better than she knew most things in her life, and she could see the thing happening behind his eyes, the rapid, invisible computation of a man deciding how much he already knows and how much he can still contain. "I don't remember exactly," he said. "Early on, there was a plumbing thing." "Was there?" A pause. "Arya, was there a plumbing problem in the East Wing room, Marco, or did you move him because you found something you weren't supposed to find?" The frittata made a small sound in the oven. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the lemon tree moved slightly in the breeze that was coming through the kitchen window. Marco set down his mug. He looked at the table between them. He looked at the window. He looked at the table again. And then he looked at her, and his face had changed. The composure hadn't cracked exactly, but it had shifted, the way a face shifts when a man decides to stop performing and just be what he is. "How did you find out?" he said. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. She had known, intellectually, since the warehouse. She had run the logic and arrived at the only conclusion that held. But there is a difference between knowing something as logic and having the other person confirm it, and the confirmation hit her somewhere low in the chest, somewhere that the professional voice and the walls and 13 years of practice couldn't entirely cover. "He told me his room was never in the East Wing," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He told me the night we were stuck in the warehouse, during the storm." She paused. "He didn't know about the letter. I told him." Marco's jaw tightened. "You told him?" "Yes." "Arya, don't." The word came out harder than she intended. She steadied herself. "Don't start with whatever you're about to start with. Just tell me the truth. You found it." A long moment. Outside, the lemon tree. Inside, the quiet hum of a house that had no idea it was the setting for the worst conversation she would have this decade. "Yes," Marco said. "I found it." She breathed through her nose. "And you read it?" "Yes." "And you destroyed it." He didn't answer immediately. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was managing something. The micro-adjustment of a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where the wrong expression could cost you. But this wasn't one of those rooms, and she was not one of those people, and he seemed to know it. "Yes," he said. The single syllable dropped into the kitchen and sat there. "You were 16, he said, and his voice was not apologetic, not yet, but braced. The voice of a man explaining something he'd spent a long time deciding was right, and was now, for the first time, not sure of. "You were 16 years old, and you were writing love letters to a man who was already inside the organization, who was on his way to running half the West Coast. You had no idea what that world—" "I wasn't asking to join his world," she said. "I was 16. I was telling him how I felt." "And then what? What happens after he reads it? What do you think happens?" "I think he answers it. I think he tells me something honest, and I carry it or I don't, and I grow up and I make my own choices." "He wasn't safe, Arya. That wasn't your decision to make. You were my sister." The words came out with a force she hadn't expected from him, not here, not in this conversation, and she heard underneath them something that wasn't just protectiveness, something that was close to grief. "You were 16, and you were such a good person. You were the only good thing in that whole house that didn't have an angle, didn't have a performance. I was not going to let that world near you." "It wasn't your decision," she said again. "I was not yours to manage." "I know." His voice broke slightly on the second word. Caught. He pressed his hand flat on the table, gathered himself. "I know that. You took something from me. I know." You took 13 years from me. The words were quiet and they were enormous, and they landed on the table between them like something that couldn't be unput down. Marco looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since they were children, since the time he was 12 and had broken something valuable and had stood in front of their father's study, knowing what was coming and unable to run from it. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I know you did." She held his gaze. "That's the part I haven't figured out how to get past yet." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he got up, very slowly, and went to the oven and took out the frittata and set it on the counter and stood there with his back to her. His shoulders were set. His hands were flat on the counter. She could see the tension in him from across the room, the held quality of a man who doesn't have anywhere to put what he's carrying. "What do you need from me?" he said. She thought about it. "I need you to tell Mom and Dad," she said. "I need you to tell them what you did, not today, but before this is over." He didn't move. "And I need you to understand," she continued, "that I'm going to be very angry with you for a long time, and I need you to let me be." He turned around. His face was older, suddenly, or maybe she was just seeing it clearly for the first time in years. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the kitchen door. She stopped in the frame, not because she had more to say, not yet, but because something needed to be acknowledged before she left, something true that the anger didn't erase. "I know you loved me," she said, without turning around. "That's what makes it hard." She heard him exhale behind her. Then she walked out of the kitchen, through the front door, down the porch steps, past the lemon tree, and sat in her car for a long time with the engine off and her hands in her lap, not moving. The things she had been right about, and the things she had been wrong about, and the thing that could never be returned to her, all three of them sitting in the front seat of her car in the Silver Lake afternoon. She got out her phone. She stared at Dante's contact information, the personal card, the number she'd entered but hadn't used, for a long moment. Then she put the phone in her bag, started the car, and drove. She was not ready. But the door was open. And somewhere behind her, at a kitchen table in Silver Lake, her brother was sitting with something he'd carried for 20 years, finally setting it down. And somewhere in Century City, in a tower full of careful people and expensive silence, Dante Moretti was waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. And none of them, not one, had any idea that the worst of it hadn't happened yet. That what Marco had done in private was about to happen in public, in front of all of them, at a dinner table with their parents and their history, and nowhere to. The dinner was her mother's idea. Sandra Holloway had been engineering family gatherings for 40 years with the particular skill of a woman who understood that the table was the only place where people couldn't entirely avoid each other, and she deployed this understanding without mercy. She called Aria on a Tuesday, 3 days after the Silver Lake kitchen, and said she was making Sunday dinner and everyone was coming and she expected Aria at 6 o'clock and not 6:50. Everyone, in Sandra's vocabulary, meant Aria, Marco, their father Carmine, and whatever guests Sandra had decided belonged at the table that week. "Is Dante coming?" Aria asked, because she needed to know, because the answer would determine how she prepared herself. A slight pause on Sandra's end. "He mentioned he might stop by after." Aria translated this accurately. Dante had been invited and had accepted, and Sandra was managing the information carefully because Sandra always knew more than she disclosed. "Fine," Aria said. "I'll be there at 6. She spent the intervening days working. This was her primary coping mechanism, and she had never pretended otherwise. When the interior landscape became too complex to navigate, she redirected the energy outward, into deliverables, into strategy decks, into the clean and solvable problems of other people's brand identities. She put in 11-hour days on the Moretti project and told herself this was professional diligence and not displacement behavior. And the lie was thin enough that she didn't look at it too directly. She and Dante exchanged exactly 4 emails in those 3 days, all work-related, all precise. He didn't ask how the conversation with Marco had gone. She didn't volunteer it. The restraint on both sides was the kind that cost something. On Sunday, she drove to her parents' house in Los Feliz in a dark green dress she'd owned for 2 years, arrived at 5:58, and stood on the front porch for 30 seconds before going in. The house smelled like her entire childhood, garlic and wine, and the particular wood polish her mother had been using on the floors since before Arya could remember. Her father was in the living room with the television on low, and he stood when she came in and hugged her the way Carmine Holloway always hugged, which was completely and without reservation, because whatever her father lacked in emotional vocabulary, he made up for in physical presence. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine, Dad." "You look tired," he said again, because Carmine also didn't accept deflection. Her mother came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, and kissed her on both cheeks, and looked at her with the specific maternal surveillance that Arya had never been able to fully evade. Sandra said nothing about how she looked. Sandra filed the observation away. Marco arrived at 6:10. He came through the front door with a bottle of wine and the particular performance of normalcy that Arya recognized from their childhood. The extra ease, the wider smile, the body language of a man working slightly harder than the situation required. He kissed their mother, embraced their father, and then turned to Arya. They looked at each other. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He handed her the wine bottle, not intentionally, just the nearest pair of hands, and she took it and they went into the kitchen together, and nothing about the exchange would have read as wrong to anyone watching. But Arya could feel the thing between them, the unfinished weight of the Silver Lake kitchen hanging in the air between their bodies like a frequency only they could hear. Dinner was pasta and a roasted chicken and a salad with fennel that her mother made every winter, and conversation moved the way it always moved in this house, loud and overlapping and occasionally competitive, Carmine holding court on some matter of local politics, while Sandra redirected with the smooth competence of long practice. Arya ate and answered questions and let the familiar noise of her family wash over her. Marco was careful with her all through dinner. Careful in his eye contact, careful in how he directed conversation, careful in the way of a man who was managing something that hadn't yet been resolved. She watched him be careful and felt, beneath the anger that was still there and would be there for a long time, the exhausting complexity of loving someone who had hurt you. Dante arrived at 8:15. She heard the door. Her mother had given him a key years ago, which was its own significant fact. And then his voice in the hallway, warm and unhurried, greeting Sandra. Her father was already on his feet, the way Carmine always was for Dante, because Carmine had a particular regard for men who had built things from nothing through force of will, and Dante Moretti qualified on every dimension. He came into the dining room, and the room reorganized around him the way rooms did, and his eyes found Arya immediately. Not obviously, not in a way that announced itself, but immediately nonetheless. "Arya," he said. "Dante," she said. Her mother set an extra place at the table without being asked. Dante sat across from Marco, which placed him diagonally from Arya, which meant she could see his face clearly without looking directly at him, which was either fortunate or the opposite. For 30 minutes, things were fine. The conversation expanded to include Dante and became the kind of dinner table discussion that Arya had watched unfold in this house her whole life. Easy, familiar, occasionally barbed in the way of people who had known each other long enough to earn the right. Her father asked Dante about the Sonoma property. Dante described the storm with a dry humor that made Carmine laugh. Her mother asked about the vineyard's harvest timeline. Arya refilled her wine and watched Marco across the table. He was watching Dante, not in any visible way, not staring, but she knew her brother's attention, had studied it her entire life, and she could see the particular quality of his watchfulness, the way his eyes moved between Dante's face and Arya's face, and then back, tracking something, calculating something. He knew. He knew that she had talked to Dante. He knew that Dante knew. And he was sitting at the table with both of them, in their parents' house, with everything unresolved and nothing yet spoken publicly, and she could see the pressure of it building in the set of his jaw. She should have known, from that, what was coming. She should have seen it. It was her mother who inadvertently opened the door. Sandra had been telling a story about a neighbor's renovation, something about permits and city inspectors and the particular comedy of bureaucratic obstruction. And the table was laughing, and then Sandra said, in the idle way of someone filling a conversational pause, "Arya, didn't you have a little crush on Dante when you were young? I remember thinking it was the sweetest thing." The table went quiet with the specific quality of quiet that occurs when something lands wrong in a public space. Arya felt the blood leave her face. Across the table, her father looked at his wine glass. Her mother looked between Arya and Dante with the suddenly watchful expression of a woman who had realized, half a second too late, that she had said something with teeth in it. Dante was very still. And Marco? Marco was looking at the table with both hands flat on the surface and his jaw locked in the way of a man who had just heard the cue he'd been dreading and now had to decide what to do with it. "Mom," Arya said. Her voice was very quiet. "Leave it." "I just thought, Sandra." Carmine's voice was mild but firm, the one-word redirect he'd been using for 40 years. And that might have been it. That might have been the moment that passed, uncomfortable, quickly covered, the conversation redirecting to something safer. That happens at dinner tables. Things are said and then they're moved past and the meal continues and the wine is poured and the moment becomes, in time, just an awkward memory. Except Marco said, "She did." Everyone looked at him. Everyone. He was still looking at the table. His hands were flat and still. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before, hollowed out, pressurized, like a man releasing something he'd been holding so long he'd forgotten it had weight. "She did have a crush on him," Marco said. "She had more than a crush." He looked up. Not at Arya. At Dante. "She wrote you a letter when she was 16. The room went absolutely silent. Dante's expression didn't change. He was already braced for this. She could see that, could see the controlled stillness of a man who had known this was coming and had decided not to preempt it. His eyes moved to Arya for a fraction of a second. She couldn't read what was in them. Her mother had set down her fork. Her father had gone very still in the particular way of Carmine Holloway when he was paying complete attention and not signaling it. Arya looked at Marco. "Don't," she said. He looked at her then. His face. God, his face. She had not expected what was on it. She had expected shame or defiance or the careful management she'd been watching all evening. What was on his face instead was something much harder to look at, something that looked like a man who had reached the end of a very long road and couldn't carry the weight of it anymore. "I found it," Marco said. "The letter. She'd slipped it under the wrong door. It came under mine." Silence. "Marco," Carmine's voice was careful, measuring the room. "I read it." Marco's voice didn't waver, but it was costing him something visible. "And I didn't give it to him. I destroyed it." The word "destroyed" dropped into the dining room of the house in Los Feliz and landed on the good tablecloth and the half-finished pasta and the fennel salad and the family that had been sitting around this table for decades. And for a long moment, no one in the room moved or spoke. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. Her father looked at Marco with an expression that Arya couldn't interpret. Something old in it, something complicated. The face of a man who was receiving information he needed to process before he could respond to it. Dante looked at Marco steadily, not with anger, or not only with anger, with the particular expression of a man who is confirming something he had already calculated and is now sitting with the confirmation. And Marco looked at Arya. "I was 21, he said. "You were 16. He was already—" His jaw tightened. "I thought I was protecting you." Arya didn't say anything. "I know what I did," Marco said. "I know what it cost." His voice broke slightly on the last word. Not dramatically, just a small fracture, the kind that's worse for being controlled. "I'm sorry, Arya. I have been sorry for a long time." The room waited. Arya looked at her brother across the dinner table. Her brother who had walked her to school and killed spiders in her bedroom and sat with her in the hospital waiting room when their grandfather was dying and taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning, and felt the full, terrible complexity of loving someone who had taken something from you that you could never get back. She looked at her mother, who had her hand still at her mouth, and was looking at Arya with an expression that was entirely maternal and entirely helpless. She looked at her father, who was looking at Marco with the face of a man conducting an internal reckoning. She looked at Dante. He was looking at her, only at her, with an expression that was careful and present and raw in a way she had only seen once before, in a stone warehouse with a storm outside, and it undid something in her that she had been trying to keep fastened. She pushed her chair back from the table. "Ariati," her mother started. "I need a minute," she said, and stood, and walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen, out the back door into the yard. The yard was dark and cold, the air carrying the particular Los Angeles November chill that people from other climates always underestimated. She stood on the back porch with her arms crossed over her chest and breathed. The lemon tree, her parents had one too, a twin of Marco's, planted the same year, stood at the far edge of the yard, and she looked at it and breathed and tried to locate herself in the wreckage of the last 15 minutes. She heard the back door open behind her, then close. She knew the footstep without turning around. Dante came to stand beside her. Not behind her. Beside her, at the edge of the porch, looking out at the same dark yard. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You knew I was going to tell them," he said. Not a question. "I knew Marco was going to say something tonight. I could see it building." She looked at the lemon tree. "I didn't know it would be like that. He needed to say it." "I know. Does it change anything? Him saying it out loud?" She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "It changes that my parents know," she said. "It changes that you were in the room. It changes—" She stopped. "It makes it real in a different way. Private things are bearable because they're private. When they become public, they become permanent," Dante said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you all right?" "You keep asking me that." "You keep not answering it." She turned and looked at him in the low light coming through the kitchen window. His profile, the line of his jaw, the stillness that had always made her want to watch him. "No," she said. "I'm not all right. I've been not all right for 13 years, and I'm particularly not all right tonight. But I'm—" She searched for the word. "Functional." That word again. "It's a good word." He looked at her. "Come back inside when you're ready. There's no timeline." He moved to go back in. "Dante," he stopped. "What you said in the warehouse." She kept her voice even, clinical almost, because it was the only way she could say it. "That it would have mattered, that you noticed." She looked at him directly. "Was that the truth, or was that you being decent to a woman who just told you she wrote you a letter at 16? He turned around fully. In the low light, he was all shadow and precision, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the warehouse. Stripped of the careful management, the practiced composure. "I've been waiting 11 years to have a conversation with you that doesn't feel like walking into a wall," he said. "Every time I tried to understand what happened between us, you shut the door. I didn't know why. I thought I'd done something, said something, crossed some line I couldn't identify. And every time I saw you, I went through the whole list again trying to find it." He paused. "That's not decency. That's what 13 years of not knowing looks like." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He went back inside. She stood in the cold yard for another minute, then followed. Inside, the dining room had rearranged itself around the revelation. Her mother was in the kitchen, audibly doing something with dishes that was less about dishes and more about needing to do something with her hands. Her father was at the table, still seated, with his wine glass and the expression of a man conducting a long private conversation with himself. Marco was standing near the window. He'd moved from the table. He looked up when Arya came back in. She walked to him. He watched her come, and she could see the particular held quality of a man bracing for what he deserved. She stopped in front of him. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said, "and I need you to understand what you actually took." Her voice was steady. She had decided, standing in the cold yard, that she was going to say this now, here, while they were all in the same room and the walls were already down and there was no point in managing it any further. "You didn't protect me from a dangerous situation. I wasn't in a dangerous situation. I was a 16-year-old girl who told the truth to someone she cared about. That's all. That's the thing you decided you had the right to intervene in." Marco's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in the way that had nothing to do with anger. "And because you did," she continued, "I spent 13 years believing I was someone who could be read and dismissed. I built my entire—" Her voice caught. She pressed through it. "I built myself around that, around being the kind of person who doesn't need anyone enough to get hurt." "Arya, I'm not done." She held up a hand. "I love you. That's not in question. And I know you were scared, and you were 21, and you were doing what you thought was right. But what you thought was right was wrong, Marco. It was wrong. And it had consequences that you never saw because I made sure you never saw them. And I need you to sit with that, not to punish you, because it's true. He exhaled, a long, uneven breath that was the closest she'd ever seen her brother come to coming apart in a room full of people. I know, he said. His voice was wrecked. I know, Arya. She nodded once. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, because that was also true. The loving him was also true. And she was tired of only being able to hold one true thing at a time. He held her back, his arms around her shoulders, his face turned away, and she could feel the tension in him, the long-held weight of 2 decades of guilt finding, at last, a place to land. Across the room, she was aware of Dante standing in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, watching them. She was aware of her father at the table with his wine glass. She was aware of her mother, who had stopped doing things in the kitchen and was standing very still. She let go of Marco. She looked at Dante. He looked back. And in his face, she saw something she didn't have a word for. Something that wasn't pity, and wasn't relief, and wasn't the careful, composed thing he usually showed the world. Something older than that. Something that looked, from where she was standing, like a man finally understanding the shape of a story he'd been living in the middle of for over a decade without knowing the whole of it. She looked away first. I'm going to go, she said to the room. I'll call tomorrow, Mom. Her mother appeared from the kitchen doorway. Stay. Have coffee. Not tonight. She picked up her bag from the chair. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She touched her father's shoulder as she passed him. She did not look at Marco again, not because she was angry. She was. But it was the complicated anger, the grief-adjacent kind, but because she had said what she needed to say, and staying longer would only unravel it. She passed Dante in the doorway. I'll be in touch about the Morrison review on Wednesday, she said. Work. The professional voice, the only stable surface she had left tonight. His hand caught her wrist. Not hard, barely pressure, but enough. She stopped, looked at his hand, looked up. He was very close. The doorway was narrow, and they were standing in it, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones that hadn't been there at 21. Not tonight, he said quietly. You don't have to do that tonight. She looked at him for a moment that stretched beyond what she could categorize. I know, she said. He let go. She walked out of the house, down the front steps, to her car parked at the curb under the amber light of the street lamp. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Through the front window of her parents' house, she could see the shapes of the people she loved most in the world moving through the aftermath of a dinner table revelation, beginning the long, imperfect work of recalibrating around a new truth. She started the car. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown, no, not unknown, she'd just never texted him before. The personal number from the matte black card. One line. The park where you used to go. The one near your parents' house. I know which one. She stared at the screen. Another message appeared beneath it. Not tonight, but soon. There are things I should have said a long time ago, and I'm done waiting for the right moment because there isn't one. There's only the moment you decide to stop. She didn't go to the park that night. She drove home instead, took a shower hot enough to sting, and stood at her kitchen window with a glass of water and her phone face down on the counter. The text was still there. She didn't need to look at it to see it. It had already done what it was going to do, lodged itself somewhere behind her sternum where she couldn't reason it away. There's only the moment you decide to stop. He hadn't finished the sentence. She didn't know if that was intentional or if he'd simply stopped typing and sent it anyway. But the incompleteness of it had stayed with her the entire drive home, filling in differently each time she turned it over. Stop running. Stop pretending. Stop building the walls and calling it strength. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 1:30. At 1:31, she picked up her phone and typed, tomorrow, 10 a.m. She put the phone down before she could reconsider it. His reply came in under a minute. A single word. Okay. The park was 6 blocks from her parents' house, tucked between 2 residential streets in a neighborhood that had been there long enough to have genuine trees, old oaks, heavy-limbed, the kind that took decades to grow into themselves. There was a bench near the largest one, positioned so it faced a small rise in the ground rather than the street, which created the particular illusion of privacy that public parks occasionally managed. Arya had found it when she was 14 and had come back to it through most of her adolescence because it was the kind of place where you could sit and think without anyone needing anything from you. She had written the letter here. She had not been back since she was 18. Dante was already there when she arrived at 5 minutes to 10. Standing rather than sitting, hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, looking at the oak tree with the focused neutrality of a man who had arrived early and was using the time to prepare rather than to wait. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the path. She stopped a few feet away. The morning was cool and clear. The kind of Los Angeles November day that was genuinely beautiful if you weren't too preoccupied to notice it. She noticed it peripherally. The light through the oak, the smell of damp grass. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "You did." Something in his face was different from last night. The dinner table careful composure was gone, and what was underneath it was less managed, more direct. The face of a man who had also been awake at 1:30 and had made some decisions in the dark. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." She looked at him. "All right, I have been watching you walk away from me for 11 years, he said. "Every dinner, every family event, every time our paths crossed, you were there, and then you were gone. And I told myself it was the situation, it was the world I was in. It was the right thing to let you keep the distance you were keeping. I told myself you were better off without the proximity." He paused. His jaw worked slightly. "That was a lie I got comfortable with. The truth was that I didn't know how to close the distance without understanding why it existed. And now I know why it existed." She held very still. "Your brother made a decision 20 years ago," Dante continued, "and it cost both of us something significant. I'm not here to relitigate that. Marco did what he did, and you've already said what needed to be said to him, and that's between the two of you." He looked at her directly. "But I'm here to tell you that I am done letting that decision have consequences. I'm done letting a letter that never reached me determine what does or doesn't happen between us." The oak tree moved slightly overhead. A bird somewhere in it. "Say something," he said. "I'm letting you finish." A breath. "I'm finished." She looked at the bench, her bench, the one where she'd sat at 16 with a notebook and too many feelings and the terrifying audacity of a girl who believed that honesty was worth the risk. She walked to it and sat down. After a moment, he came and sat beside her. Not close, appropriate distance, but beside her, which was different from across from her, different from the conference table and the dinner table and the careful architecture of the last 3 weeks. "I spent 13 years being angry at you," she said. "Not at Marco, at you." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I knew it wasn't rational. I knew intellectually that you hadn't done anything, but the anger needed somewhere to go, and you were the one it attached to. You were the evidence of what it felt like to be read and dismissed." She paused. "Except you never read it." "No. Which means I built—" She stopped, started again. "The person I became after that letter, the way I work, the way I keep people at a specific distance and call it professionalism, the way I've been with you for 11 years. She looked up. "I built all of that on a false premise." Dante was watching her with the particular focused attention she'd been trying not to respond to for 3 weeks. "Does that change it?" he said, "knowing the premise was false?" "I don't know yet." She said it honestly without softening it. "I know the anger was misplaced. I know you were not the person who made that decision, but the walls—" She pressed her lips together. "The walls don't come down just because you understand why they went up. It doesn't work that way." "I know. I'm telling you because I don't want to—" She exhaled. "I don't want to do the thing where I act like this is simple now. Like all we have to do is acknowledge it, and everything recalibrates. That's not what I'm asking for." She looked at him. "What are you asking for?" He held her gaze. "Permission," he said, "to stop pretending I don't—" His jaw tightened. He looked away briefly, looked back. "I've been careful around you for 11 years. Careful not to push. Careful not to make it worse. I'm asking if I can stop being careful." The morning light came through the oak at a specific angle and put everything in the kind of clarity that you couldn't argue with. "Yes," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her, not carefully, not tentatively. with the directness of a man who had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its own kind of damage, and who had decided in the dark of the previous night that he was done accruing it. His hand came up to her jaw. Just his fingers, just that, but certain. And she felt every wall she'd built, and every year she'd spent building them, and the particular shock of having something she'd wanted for so long arrive without the buffer of distance. She kissed him back. For a moment there was nothing else. No oak tree, no park, no November morning, no 11 years, no letter. Just the warmth of his hand against her face, and the certainty of the contact and the specific feeling of a door opening that she had believed for most of her adult life was permanently sealed. Then his phone rang. He pulled back. His hand stayed at her jaw for a moment longer before he let go. He looked at the phone screen with the particular expression of a man receiving bad news before he'd even answered. "I have to take this," he said. "Take it." He stood, moved a few feet away, answered. She watched him. Watched the quality of his attention change, the shift from personal to operational, like a frequency change, something clicking into the professional register. His voice dropped. He was listening more than speaking. When he came back to the bench, the morning had a different texture. "What happened?" she said. She pescashikul. He sat down. His face was controlled, but under it something was moving fast. "There's a situation with one of the hospitality properties. I need to go." He looked at her. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. Go." Arietsa. Dante. She held his gaze. "I've been here this long. I'm not going anywhere." Something moved through his expression, something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was related to both. "I'll call you tonight," he said. He stood. She watched him walk back toward the park entrance, the same long, purposeful stride she'd been watching since she was 14, and the image of it landed differently now, without the distance, without the anger layered over it. She stayed on the bench for a while after he left. The oak tree moved overhead. She sat underneath it and breathed and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, exist in the present tense of something instead of the managed distance of it. He called at 7:15. "The situation is more complicated than it looked this morning," he said. His voice was measured. She'd learned over the last several weeks to read the register of it, when it was measured because he was presenting information, and when it was measured because something was wrong that he hadn't fully assessed yet. This was the second kind. "Tell me," she said. "Not on the phone." A pause. "Can you come to the Century City office? I know it's..." "When?" "Now. If you can." She was already reaching for her jacket. 40 minutes. She made it in 35. The 22nd floor at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening had a specific atmosphere. The skeleton crew of people for whom the work had no weekend, the low hum of infrastructure, the particular fluorescent honesty of a space that was normally dressed with daylight and intentional lighting. Vera met her at the elevator. Vera looked like she'd been there for hours, which she probably had. "He's in the main conference room," Vera said. "Patterson is here, and 2 others from the legal team. What's the situation?" Vera hesitated. In 3 weeks of working with this woman, Arya had observed that Vera hesitated approximately never. "Mr. Moretti will brief you," she said. That was its own kind of answer. Dante was at the head of the conference table when she came in. Jacket off, sleeves pushed up, a posture that said he'd been at the table for a while. Patterson was there, and 2 lawyers she didn't recognize. There were documents spread across the table that someone had partially covered when she came in, which she noted. "Arya." He stood. "Thank you for coming." "Tell me what's happening." He looked at Patterson. Patterson looked at the lawyers. There was a consultation happening in that exchange, brief and wordless. "Sit down," Dante said. She sat. He remained standing. "There's a problem with the rebrand project," he said, "specifically with how it's been positioned externally." She felt the first cold edge of something. "What does that mean?" Someone leaked preliminary materials, the brand architecture framework, the positioning strategy. It went to a competing entity. His voice was even, precise, the voice he used when he was delivering information that required the listener to receive it without noise. Materials that at this stage only existed within my organization and within Holloway Creative. The cold edge became a blade. She looked at him steadily. What are you saying? I'm saying the leak came from one of two places. His eyes met hers. Not with accusation, but not without it either. And I need to understand which one. The room was very quiet. You think it came from my firm, she said. I think it came from somewhere, he said, and I need to investigate both possibilities. Dante. Her voice was flat and careful. Look at me. He was already looking at her. If you are asking me whether someone at Holloway Creative leaked confidential client materials, she said, the answer is no. And if you are asking me whether I would have been aware of it if they had, the answer is also no. But I would find out, and the consequences would be immediate and permanent. She paused. Is that what you're asking? I'm asking for your help identifying the source. That's not what it sounded like. Patterson shifted in his chair. One of the lawyers made a small movement toward his notepad. Patterson. Dante's voice didn't change pitch. Give us a moment. Patterson and the two lawyers gathered their things and moved to the anteroom without comment. The conference room door closed behind them. In the silence that followed, Arya was very aware of the documents spread across the table, partially covered, but she could see the edge of what appeared to be her firm's project letterhead. She was aware of Dante standing at the head of the table with his sleeves pushed up and his face in the controlled expression that she now knew, from 3 weeks of watching him and one morning in a park, was not his neutral. It was his braced. How bad is it? She said. Bad enough that the competing entity is threatening to use the materials in a way that could undermine the entire rebrand strategy before it launches. And the source? He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. We traced the transmission to a device that accessed our secure project server. The access credentials belonged to one of your associates. She felt the floor do something. Which associate? A junior team member, Priya Anand. The name hit her like cold water. Priya. 24 years old and terrifyingly competent. Priya, who had asked Dante intelligent questions at the vineyard dinner and whom Arya had just 3 weeks ago, told him was going to be exceptional. Priya, who had been on the project from day one and had access to every framework, every strategy document, every piece of the positioning architecture. You're certain, Arya said. The IT forensics team is certain. The access was from her credentials at 2:17 a.m. last Wednesday. His voice was still even, still careful, but underneath it was something that she needed to pay attention to. Not anger, something more structural. The sound of a man whose trust had been built carefully, over time, and was now being stress-tested in a way that had consequences beyond the professional. There's a second component, he said. She looked at him. The competing entity that received the materials. He paused. They're connected to your brother. The room stopped. Not Marco. The thought was immediate and involuntary, and she pushed it down before it became a full sentence because she needed to hear the rest. Marco? She said. Not directly. Not Marco personally. Dante picked up a document from the table and held it out to her. She took it. It was a corporate structure diagram, names and entities connected by lines, the kind of thing that took forensic accounting to produce. A shell company, 2 steps removed from a real estate entity that Marco has been connected to through your father's old network. She looked at the diagram. She traced the lines with her finger. 2 steps was 2 steps. It wasn't Marco. It wasn't even close to Marco, but it was the kind of proximity that would look significant to anyone who didn't know the difference between connection and culpability. This doesn't implicate Marco, she said. No. But it will look like it does. Yes. He sat down across from her. If this goes public, if the competing entity uses these materials and the source comes out, the connection to your brother is going to be in the story. It won't matter that it's 2 steps removed. The headline writes itself. She set the document down. She thought about Marco at the dinner table last night, his hands flat on the surface, the broken quality of his voice when he said, I know. She thought about what he had carried for 20 years, and about the conversation on his porch, and about the fact that her brother had made a catastrophic mistake out of love, which did not absolve him, but did mean that what he deserved was the complicated reckoning they'd begun. Not a public detonation built on proximity to a corporate espionage case, She looked at Dante. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you to talk to Priya tonight, before my legal team does. If there's an explanation, there isn't going to be an explanation." Her voice was flat. She already knew this, could feel it, the way you can feel when something true is waiting under a surface you haven't broken yet. Priya is 24 years old and exceptional, and somebody got to her. That's what happened. Who would get to her? I don't know yet. She stood. But I'm going to find out. Arya, this is my firm, she said. Whatever happened under my firm's name is my responsibility. I will handle it. She picked up her bag. But I need you to tell me something first. He looked at her. This morning, she said. The park. That happened before you knew about the leak. Yes. And it's not affecting how you're presenting this to me right now. He held her gaze steadily. I told you, I'm done being careful around you. That includes this. I'm giving you the same information I'd give anyone with a stake in this situation. And the same directness. A pause. The fact that this morning happened doesn't make you more or less responsible for your associate's actions, and it doesn't change what I said under that tree. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. She walked to the conference room door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, her back half turned. One more thing, she said. You said the access was at 2:17 a.m. on Wednesday. Yes. Wednesday was the day after the family dinner. A silence. Yes, Dante said. She turned that over. The family dinner, Marco's confession, everything exposed and rearranged. And the following morning, before the dust had settled, someone accessing the project server in the middle of the night with Priya's credentials. The timing was too specific to be coincidence. Someone knew, she said. About Marco's confession, about the dinner. They moved fast. Dante stood slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying Priya didn't do this on her own, and whoever used her credentials did it the night after our family situation became, she searched for the word, leverageable. The conference room was very quiet. Dante's face had gone through several things in rapid succession, and what it had settled on was an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not anger, which she'd expected, and not the controlled composure, which was his default. Something colder than both. The specific quality of a man who has just identified the architecture of something he had previously only felt the edges of. Get Patterson back in here, he said. Arya didn't move toward the door. Dante. He looked at her. Whatever this is, she said, whoever is behind this, they used my firm to get to you. They used someone on my team. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not, and she pressed the one closest to him, flat against the doorframe. That means they knew about our working relationship. They knew enough about us to know that moving through Holloway Creative was the fastest way to reach the Moretti Group's materials. She held his gaze, which means they've been watching this project since it started. The implication sat in the room between them. Since it started. Since before the gala. Since before the vineyard. Since before any of the things that had changed between them in the last 3 weeks had happened. Someone had been watching, and they had waited for exactly the right moment. The moment when the personal and the professional were most entangled, when the Holloway name was connected to the Moretti name in the most visible and complicated way. To pull the trigger. Dante's jaw was set. His eyes were dark and absolutely focused. Who knew about the project from the beginning? He said. Who had that visibility? My firm. Your firm. She paused. And anyone who is paying attention to the Holloway family. The words landed. They looked at each other across the conference room, and between them was the full weight of everything that had been building since the night of the dinner table. Marco's confession, the letter, the park bench, the professional partnership, the 13 years. All of it suddenly not just a personal story, but a liability. Evidence. Leverage. Someone had turned their history into a weapon. And Priya Anand, who was 24 and brilliant, and had not yet learned that the world contained people who would use those qualities against you, was sitting somewhere right now not knowing what was about to. Priya answered on the second ring. She was home. Arya could hear it in the background quality of the call, the particular quiet of a small apartment on a Sunday night. When Arya said her name, there was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. 1 second was enough. I need you to come in, Arya said. Tonight. Another pause. Is everything okay? No, Arya said. It's not. Come to the Century City office. I'll be here. She hung up before Priya could construct a response. She found an empty office down the hall from the conference room. Smaller, no windows, a table and 2 chairs, and the kind of fluorescent overhead that made everything look like evidence. She sat in one of the chairs and waited and thought about what she knew and what she needed to hear said out loud before she could act on it. Priya arrived in 40 minutes. She was dressed like someone who had not expected to leave the house. Jeans, a dark sweater, her hair down instead of the precise ponytail she wore in every professional context. She was 24 years old, and when she walked into the office and saw Arya's face, whatever remaining hope she'd been carrying on the drive over visibly left her body. She sat down. Arya looked at her for a long moment. Priya looked back. Tell me who approached you, Arya said. Priya's hands were in her lap. Arya could see them clasped together, knuckles slightly pale. I don't... Priya. Arya's voice was quiet and absolute. The IT forensics team has already traced the transmission. Your credentials, 2:17 a.m. Wednesday. The only questions left are the ones only you can answer, and the speed at which you answer them is going to determine how much of your career survives this. She paused. So I need you to tell me who approached you, when, and what they told you they needed. The silence lasted about 15 seconds. Then Priya pressed her lips together and looked at the table. A man named Kiefer, she said. Her voice was very small. He contacted me through LinkedIn 6 weeks ago, said he was a brand strategy consultant, that he was building a research firm and was looking for emerging talent. We had coffee. She stopped, swallowed. He seemed legitimate. He had credentials, a website, references. I checked. And then what? He said he was building a competitive intelligence division, that it was industry standard, that major firms did it, that it was just market research. She looked up briefly, looked back down. He said all he needed was access to preliminary brand frameworks, early stage work. He said it never left his research database. He paid you. A pause that was an answer. Yes. Arya breathed through her nose. How much? $15,000. The number came out very quietly, like she was aware of exactly how much and how little it was simultaneously. He said it was a consulting fee, that I was a research contributor, that everything was... She stopped. Her jaw was working. I knew it was wrong. I knew when I was logging in at 2 a.m. that something was... I told myself it was a gray area. It wasn't a gray area. I know. Priya's voice broke slightly. I know that. I knew it then, and I did it anyway, and I have been. Since Wednesday I have not slept. She looked at Arya with an expression that was not asking for absolution. It was too honest for that, too raw. It was the expression of someone sitting in the full, unobstructed view of their own worst decision. I'm sorry, I know that it doesn't undo it, Arya said. No. She looked at the young woman across the table. Exceptional, she'd told Dante. In about 3 years, she'll run someone's creative department, and felt the specific weight of watching someone brilliant do something stupid and recognizing, in it, every stupid thing she herself had done from a place of need or ambition or the particular blindness of believing you had it figured out. But you're going to help fix it, starting now. Priya straightened slightly. What do you need? Everything you have on Kiefer, every communication, every document, every record of the payments, the LinkedIn profile, the emails, the coffee shop, the location, the date, anything you can remember about what he looked like and what he said. I saved everything, Priya said. She said it with the particular precision of someone who had been, on some level, building an exit plan. I don't know why. I kept telling myself I'd never need it, but I kept it. Send it to me tonight. All of it. Arya stood. Then you're going to write a full account of every interaction and submit it to Patterson in the morning. Every detail. You hold nothing back. Priya stood. Her hands were still clasped in front of her. And then? Arya looked at her. And then we see what's left. She didn't soften it. Priya didn't ask her to. The name Kiefer went to Dante's security team at 11 p.m. By midnight, they had a real name. The LinkedIn profile was a shell. The website had been built 30 days before the first contact. The references were constructed, but the payment trail was real, and real trails have origins. The man's name was Curtis Hale. He was a private intelligence contractor who had done work for 3 different corporate entities over the past 5 years, none of them operating in the brand strategy space. All 3 of them had connections, at various removes, to a man named Gerald Voss. Dante knew the name. Arya could tell from the specific quality of his stillness when Patterson read it out. Not surprised, but the particular settling of a man receiving a confirmation he'd been waiting for without knowing what shape it would take. "Who is he?" she asked. "Competition," Dante said. "One word. Flat as a stone," Patterson elaborated carefully, in the language of men who are accustomed to discussing dangerous things in sanitized terms. Gerald Voss ran a hospitality and investment group out of San Francisco that operated in the same luxury market tier as 3 of the Moretti Group's primary entities. The rebrand, which would have repositioned the Moretti properties under a unified premium umbrella, would have directly threatened Voss's market positioning on the West Coast. The project materials that had been leaked contained enough of the strategic framework to allow Voss's people to preempt the rebrand, to flood the relevant market channels with counter-positioning before the Moretti launch could establish itself. It was not complicated, it was in fact the oldest kind of play. Find a point of access, find a point of pressure, move fast enough that the damage is done before anyone can locate the source. What was complicated was how precisely Voss had identified Priya as the access point, how he'd known to look inside Holloway Creative rather than inside the Moretti Group's own team, how much he'd known about the project structure, the personnel, the timeline. He had someone closer, Dante said. It was not a question. Patterson looked at his documents. "We think so, yes." "Inside my organization?" "Yes." Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Find them." And the 2 words had a particular quality that Arya understood had nothing to do with her, or the rebrand, or the professional stakes. It had to do with a world that operated on different rules than the one she worked in, rules she had been aware of in the abstract since she was 16 and was now sitting in the concrete center of at 11:45 on a Sunday night. She looked at him. He looked at her. "This is going to take time," he said, "and it's going to get uglier before it resolves." "I know." "You don't have to be in the middle of it." She held his gaze. "The leak went through my firm. I'm already in the middle of it." Something moved through his expression, not quite relief, not quite gratitude, the thing that lived between them, that had no clean name. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The next 3 weeks were the hardest work of Arya's professional life. She had managed crises before. Every consultant had. The moment when a client's brand was caught in a breaking story, or an internal leak, or a competitor's calculated move. She'd been through the controlled chaos of damage limitation, the long nights and the tactical pivots, and the very specific skill of remaining calm in a room full of people who weren't. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. But she had never managed a crisis from inside one simultaneously. She had never been at the same time the person helping to resolve the professional breach and the person navigating the personal territory that had made her firm a viable target in the first place. She had never been quite this exposed, quite this implicated, quite this present. She worked. She worked the way she'd always worked, the long hours and the clear thinking and the capacity to hold multiple competing priorities in the same frame without losing the thread of any of them. She and Dante's team identified the internal leak within 8 days. A mid-level operations manager named Sellers, who had been passing structural information to Voss's people for the better part of 4 months. Sellers was removed. The information was contained. Patterson's team filed the necessary documentation. Priya's future was determined in a conversation between Arya and Dante on the 11th day, sitting across from each other in the Century City conference room. The same room where they'd had their first professional meeting, the same table, the same pitcher of water, though everything else had changed so substantially that the room felt like it belonged to a different story. "She cooperated fully," Arya said. "She gave us everything. The information she provided was instrumental in identifying Sellers. She also sold confidential client materials for $15,000. "Yes." Arya didn't minimize it. She made a bad decision from a combination of ambition and naivety, and she's going to live with the professional consequences of it for a long time. But she's 24, and she did, when it mattered, choose correctly. Dante looked at her steadily. What are you asking for? I'm not asking you to forget it happened. I'm asking you to let her record reflect that she cooperated and to not pursue the legal action that would end her career entirely before it started. She held his gaze. That's my judgment call as the person responsible for my firm's conduct. I'm asking you to respect it. A long pause. Done, he said. Arya nodded, wrote something in her portfolio, then looked back up. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. It was the right call. She almost smiled. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. The rebrand launched 6 weeks after the Sunday night in the Century City office. It launched on time, on budget, and with the full unified identity system that Arya had designed from the beginning. The positioning strategy intact, the visual architecture solid, the regional narrative for the Sonoma properties woven through the whole in a way that was coherent and specific and genuinely good. The launch event was at the Moretti Group's flagship vineyard in Sonoma, the same property where she and Dante had been trapped in the warehouse by the storm, the same gravel drive and olive trees and old stone walls, now dressed for an evening event with several hundred guests who represented the intersection of the hospitality, luxury, and investment worlds. Arya stood near the edge of the crowd during the opening remarks, holding a glass of the vineyard's best red, and watching the presentation she'd built play out in the hands of the team who would carry it forward. She watched people respond to the brand identity she'd developed, the recognition in their faces, the instinctive positive reception that told you the positioning had landed, and felt the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of having done the work well. Cleo appeared at her shoulder. You did good, she said. We did good. You did more good than me, and you know it. Cleo touched her glass to Arya's. And for the record, I'm choosing to find the entire last 2 months romantic rather than professionally alarming. It was professionally alarming. Romantically alarming, then. Cleo looked out at the crowd. Where is he? Arya didn't have to ask who she meant. He'll be at the main remarks in about 20 minutes. And you two are... We're figuring it out, Arya said. Cleo made a sound that communicated significant volumes without using words. Is that the professional version or the actual version? The actual version. Arya looked at her. It's not simple. It's not fast. We have... She paused. There's a lot of ground to cover. Sure, Cleo said. But you're covering it. Yes, Arya said. We're covering it. Cleo smiled. The real one, not the professional one. Good, she said, and moved off into the crowd. Marco arrived late, which was unlike him, and when Arya saw him making his way through the outer edge of the gathering, she understood from his face that he debated coming at all. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, and he looked like a man who had done the better part of 3 weeks of hard internal accounting and was still mid-process. She went to him. They stood at the edge of the vineyard property, away from the main event, where the olive trees cast long shadows in the evening light, and the noise of the crowd was reduced to a manageable background hum. You came, she said. You invited me, he said. I didn't know if you would. He looked at the vines, at the hills beyond them, at the specific sunset quality of the October light that made everything in Sonoma look like it had been arranged. I wasn't going to, he said. And then I thought, I've been making decisions about what's best for you since you were too young to make them yourself, and I'm trying to stop doing that. He looked at her. So I came. She studied her brother's face. The silver at his temples, the lines that hadn't been there 10 years ago, the particular expression of a man who had put something down recently and wasn't yet sure of his balance without it. I'm not done being angry, she said. I told you that. It's true. I know, but I've been thinking about something. She looked at the vines. You were 21. You were already inside a world that had taught you that control was protection, that managing information kept people safe. She glanced at him. I'm not excusing it, but I understand it better than I did 3 weeks ago. Marco was quiet. You thought you were keeping me out of something dangerous, she said. You were wrong about what was dangerous. The letter wasn't the danger. Losing the ability to trust someone with how I felt, that was the damage. That's what I've been carrying. She turned to face him fully. I need you to understand the specific thing you took. Not your version of it, mine. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. I understand, he said. I've been understanding it in detail for 3 weeks, and it has not been comfortable. Good, she said. Not cruelly, just honestly. He exhaled. What do you need from me? Going forward. She thought about it. I need you to ask me things instead of deciding them. I need you to be the brother who trusts me with my own life. She paused. And I need you to have a real conversation with Dante. Not through me. Between you. Marco looked across the crowd to where Dante was now visible near the main staging area. Tall, dark-suited, the same contained authority he'd carried since he was 21. The two men who had been closest to each other for 2 decades, sitting now, with a weight between them that had a name and a shape and required acknowledgement. I know, Marco said. He's not going to make it easy. He shouldn't. She looked at her brother for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Not the way she'd hugged him after the dinner table revelation, which had been complicated and grief-soaked and done in front of witnesses. This was quieter. Just the two of them at the edge of a vineyard in the evening light, and the full, difficult, non-negotiable fact of the 31 years they'd been each other's family. He held on longer than she expected. When she stepped back, she looked at his face and saw that he was holding himself together with the particular effort of a man who had used up most of his reserves and was working on fumes. She recognized the look. She'd been wearing it herself for 3 weeks. Go find him, she said. Marco straightened his jacket, set his jaw, nodded once. She watched him walk toward the crowd. Halt. Dante found her 20 minutes after the main remarks, when the event had settled into the easier rhythm of an evening well underway, the crisis and the launch behind them, and the particular loosening that comes when a thing you've worked toward for months finally exists in the world. He came to where she was standing, the far edge of the property, near a low stone wall that overlooked the first row of vines, and stood beside her without ceremony. No greeting. He'd moved past greetings with her somewhere around the 3rd week, and she found she didn't miss them. Your brother found me, he said. I know. We talked for about 15 minutes. She looked at him. And? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the vines. It'll take time, he said. He knows that. I know that. A pause. He's carrying it. What he did. He's been carrying it for a long time. Yes. That's not absolution. I know, he knows. Dante nodded slowly. The event noise carried on behind them. Glasses and conversation and the low thread of music from somewhere inside the venue. The sky was doing the thing it did over Sonoma in October, the last of the light turning at colors that had no adequate name. She looked at him. You said something in the park, she said, that you noticed me even back then, that you'd thought the situation was wrong and the timing was wrong, but that what you felt... She stopped. You stopped yourself. You never finished it. He turned his head and looked at her. What did you feel? She said. He was quiet for a moment that stretched, not the performed pause of a man choosing his words for effect, the real pause of someone accessing something that had been stored very deep for a very long time. Like you were the only person in a room full of people who was actually there, he said. Not performing, not playing an angle, just there. He looked back at the vines. I've spent my entire adult life in rooms full of people playing angles. It's so constant I stopped noticing it. And then there would be this 16-year-old in a doorway reading a book and looking at the world like she was cataloging it, and everything in the room would... He stopped, almost smiled. Quiet down. She didn't say anything for a moment. I stopped doing that, she said. After the letter, I stopped letting myself just be somewhere. I know. He turned to face her fully. I've watched you not do it for 11 years. I'm aware of how you've watched me for 11 years. Are you aware, he said carefully, that I would like to watch you differently for the next 11? She held his gaze. The stone wall was at her back. The vine stretched away below them, and the last of the light was going. And behind them was a party that was their shared work and their shared crisis, and everything that had happened in between. That's a long time, she said. It's a start, he said. She looked at him. The specific face she'd been looking at since she was 14. The face she'd been angry at and armored against and professional with and had kissed on a park bench on a November morning, and felt the full complicated weight of choosing something after a long time of choosing nothing. Yes, she said. Okay. He reached over and took her hand. Just that. Not a grand gesture. Nothing about Dante Moretti was grand. Nothing was performed. Just his hand around hers, there at the edge of the vineyard, with the light going out and the evening settling in. She let him. 6 months later, the Moretti Group completed the largest luxury hospitality acquisition in the firm's history, a partnership with a regional vineyard collective that tripled the estate portfolio's footprint on the West Coast. The brand identity Aria had developed was the architecture the whole thing ran on. It was written about in 3 industry publications and cited twice in the months that followed as an example of strategic positioning done right. Aria and Cleo accepted a significant expansion of the firm's retainer with the Moretti Group. Aria also, in the same month, hired a new junior associate. She did not hire someone who reminded her of Priya. She hired someone who reminded her of herself at 24, quieter than the room expected, twice as sharp as they let on, and carrying something they hadn't yet figured out how to put down. She gave them good work and did not manage them into safety. Priya landed a position at a smaller brand consultancy in Portland 6 weeks after leaving Holloway Creative. She sent Aria an email on her first day. It was 3 sentences. Short, factual, the email of someone who was not asking for more than they'd earned. Aria wrote back 4 sentences. The correspondence ended there, which was correct, which was what it should be. Marco and Dante had 3 conversations over the following months. Aria was not present for any of them and did not ask for reports. She knew, from the particular quality of Marco's face at a January family dinner and the way Dante mentioned Marco's name once in passing, without armor, just the name, that they were doing what 2 people do when they decide the friendship is worth the difficulty of rebuilding it, slowly, without pretending the damage wasn't real. Her mother never said another word about the dinner table revelation. Sandra Holloway processed things internally and expressed them in action, and the action she chose was to invite Dante to family dinners without the elaborate social management she'd previously applied to the question of Dante and Aria in the same room. She simply invited him. He simply came. The table expanded and rearranged itself, and after a while it felt like the shape it had always been moving toward. Her father took Marco on a drive one Saturday in February. He didn't tell Aria what they talked about. She didn't ask. The following week, Carmine had Dante over for a Sunday afternoon that lasted 6 hours and involved a great deal of wine, and what Aria understood, from the second-hand account, to have been a direct and unambiguous conversation about intentions. She had been mortified, briefly. Then she had understood that her father was doing what Carmine Holloway had always done, looking at the situation clearly and dealing with it in the open, which was, she recognized, where she had gotten the same instinct from. She and Dante moved around each other slowly. This was deliberate, and it was right. They had dinner, and they walked, and they argued about small things and some medium-sized ones, and they were occasionally in each other's professional orbit and maintained the line between the 2 things with the particular care of people who understood what happened when that line blurred. She let him into her apartment on a Thursday in December, which was a significant threshold for someone who had lived alone by design for a long time, and he looked at the space she'd made for herself, the west-facing windows, the absence of clutter, the organized proof of a woman who had built her life very deliberately, and said, "It looks like you." And she had not known how to take that and then decided to take it as exactly what it was. The walls came down slowly. This was also right. You don't tear down something load-bearing without checking what it's been holding up first, and some of what the walls had been holding was genuine. Her independence, her clarity, the self she'd built that was real and not only a defense. She kept those. She was working on releasing the parts that had calcified out of old wounds rather than actual preference. It was not fast. It was not simple. It was, in every way that mattered, true. In March, at the grand opening of a second Moretti estate in the Napa Valley, another event, another project, the brand architecture she'd built continuing to do the work it was designed to do, Dante stood before the gathered guests at the end of the evening and did something she had not been prepared for. He told them about a letter, not in detail, not with names or timelines or the full weight of everything the letter had cost and carried, just the shape of it, a letter that had been written and had gotten lost, and had taken a very long time to arrive at the person it was meant for. He said it the way you say something you've decided deserves to be real in the world, spoken aloud and witnessed, rather than kept in the private space where it had lived too long already. He looked at her while he said it. She was standing at the edge of the crowd. She did not move. She was aware of Cleo beside her going very still. She was aware of the 200 people in the room who had no idea what they were witnessing the shape of. He finished speaking. He handed the microphone to the event moderator. And then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and came down off the low stage and walked toward her through the crowd that parted without being asked to, because 200 people can feel when something is about to happen that is not for them. He stopped in front of her. He was carrying something in his left hand. She looked down. A ring. Old, heavy gold with a dark stone at the center. Not purchased recently. Something with age on it, with history. The kind of object that had been held by other hands before these. His grandmother's ring. She knew this without being told, the way you know certain things about a person after you have spent enough time paying attention. He looked at her. "I am not a simple man," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only she heard it. Not the room, not the crowd, just her. And this is not a simple situation, and I am aware that we have covered a lot of difficult ground to get here, and that we are not done covering it. He held her gaze. But I know what I want. I've known what I wanted for a long time. I'm done being careful about it. She looked at him, at the ring, at his face. The one she had watched from doorways at 14, had written letters about at 16, had been angry at for 11 years, and had kissed on a park bench in November, and had sat beside in a stone warehouse while a storm tried to come through the walls. The room was very quiet. "That is possibly," she said, "the least romantic proposal I've ever heard." Something broke open in his face. "I know. I had a better version. I lost my nerve." "You," she said, "lost your nerve. Don't tell anyone." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the letter she'd written at 16, careful and honest and terrifying, and about the 13 years it had taken for it to arrive, and about the fact that despite everything, despite the interceptions and the silences and the walls and the damage and the long, complicated cost of misunderstanding, it had arrived. Some things survive what should have stopped them. She had survived. He had survived. Whatever this was between them had survived in the dark, without acknowledgement, without air, for longer than anyone should have asked it to. She reached out and took the ring from his hand. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. She slid the ring onto her own finger. He reached out and helped her seat it, both of their hands in the same space, and it fit the way things fit when they've been waiting for the right place to land. And when she looked up, he was looking at her with an expression she had no precedent for in her knowledge of his face. Something without management in it. Something completely unguarded. He kissed her. The crowd did something. She was barely aware of it. 1 year later, in the house they had moved into together in the hills above Silver Lake, a house with west-facing windows and a lemon tree in the backyard and a room she had designated as a studio for no reason she could articulate professionally, only personally. Arya sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her coffee and her phone and the specific quiet of a life that had been chosen rather than constructed out of necessity. The letter was on the wall in the hallway, not framed dramatically, just a simple frame, the wood unstained, the letter itself visible through the glass. She had written it in pencil at 16, on paper from a notebook she'd long since thrown away. And it had survived 20 years of being in her brother's possession in the way that things sometimes survive by accident, stuffed in the back of a drawer rather than truly destroyed, held on to by the person who took it for reasons they couldn't have named. Marco had given it to her 3 months after the Napa Valley opening. He'd brought it over on a Sunday in an envelope, without ceremony, and set it on her kitchen counter and said, "I found it in an old box. I kept it. I don't know why. I know that doesn't make it better." She'd taken the envelope without opening it and said thank you, and meant it, and he'd nodded and they'd had coffee and talked about something else, She'd read it alone that night. She was not embarrassed by it, which surprised her. It was the work of a 16-year-old girl who had been painfully honest and more articulate than she'd given herself credit for, and reading it was not the cringing exercise in adolescent exposure she'd expected. It was something quieter, something that felt like meeting a version of herself she'd lost, and finding that she'd underestimated her. She'd asked Dante to read it. He'd read it at the kitchen table, in this house, on a Wednesday evening, and she'd watched his face while he did. He'd read it slowly. When he finished, he'd set it down carefully on the table and looked at her for a long moment and said, "You were always braver than I was." She hadn't argued. She'd had it framed the following week. Now she sat with her coffee on a Thursday morning and looked at the hallway where the frame hung on the wall and felt the particular piece of a life that had been arrived at rather than planned, full of the wrong turns and the closed doors and the 13-year silence and the storm and the warehouse and the park bench and everything it had taken to get here. She heard him moving upstairs, his footsteps on the floor overhead, the particular pattern of a man who moved through a space with deliberate economy. She heard the sound of water and then, after a while, the stairs. And then Dante was in the kitchen doorway, dressed for the day, jacket in hand, looking at her with the expression she'd been cataloging for 20 years and was still finding new things in. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He came in and poured his own coffee and stood at the counter and looked at her in the Thursday morning light, and she looked back, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing managed, nothing careful. She thought, briefly, about 16-year-old Arya in the dark hallway with a letter and a hammering heart, and the terrifying audacity of someone who had decided that honesty was worth the risk. She had been right. It had just taken a long time for the letter to arrive.